4. For the first few days after Miller left Butcher's Crossing for Ellsworth, Andrew spent much of his time in his hotel room. He lay on the thin mattress of his narrow bed and gazed at the bare walls, the roughly planked floor, the flat, low ceiling. He thought of his father's house on Clarendon Street near Beacon and the River Charles. Though he had left there with his portion of an uncle's bequest less than a month before, he felt that the house, in which he had been born and in which he had lived his youth, was very distant in time. He could summon only the dimmest image of the tall elms that surrounded the house and of the house itself. He remembered more clearly the great dim parlor and the sofa covered with dark red velvet upon which he had lain on summer afternoons, his cheek brushed by the heavy pile, his eyes following, until they were confounded, the intricately entwined floral design carved upon the walnut frame of the sofa. As if it were important, he strained his memory. Beside the sofa there had been a large lamp with a round milk-white base encircled by a chain of painted roses, and beyond that, on the wall, neatly framed, was a series of watercolors done by a forgotten aunt during her grand tour. But the image would not stay with him. Unreal, it thinned like blown fog, and Andrews came back to himself in a raw, bare room in a crudely built frame hotel in Butcher's Crossing. From that room, he could see nearly all the town. When he discovered that he could take the gauze-covered frame out of the window, he spent many hours sitting there, his arms folded on the lower frame of the window opening, his chin resting on one forearm, gazing out upon the town. His gaze alternated between the town itself, which seemed to move in a sluggish, erratic rhythm like the pulse of some brute existence, and the surrounding country. Always when his gaze lifted from the town, it went westward, toward the river, and beyond. In the clean, early morning light, the horizon was a crisp line above which was the blue and cloudless sky. Looking at the horizon, sharply defined and with a quality of absoluteness, he thought of the times when, as a boy, he had stood on the rocky coast of Massachusetts Bay and looked eastward across the grey Atlantic until his mind was choked and dizzied at the immensity he gazed upon. Older now, he looked upon another immensity in another horizon, but his mind was filled with some of the wonder he had known as a child, as if it were an intimation of some knowledge he had long ago lost. He thought now of those early explorers who had set out upon another waste, salt and wide. He remembered hearing of the superstition that told them they would come to a sharp brink and sail over it, to fall forever from the world in space and darkness. The legends had not kept them back, he knew, but he wondered how often, in their lonely sailing, they had intimations of depthless plunge, and how often they were repeated in their dreams. Looking at the horizon, he could see the line waver in the rising heat of the day. By late afternoon, with the rising winds, the line became indistinct, merged with the sky, and to the west was a vague country whose limits and extents were undefined. And as night came upon the land, creeping from the brightness, sunk like a coal in the western haze, the little town that held him seemed to contract as the dark expanded, and he had, at moments when his eye lost a point of reference, a sensation like falling, as the sailors must have had in their dreams, in their deepest fears. But a light would flicker on the street below him, or a match would flare, or a door would open to let lantern light gleam on a passing boot, and he would again discover himself sitting before an open window in his hotel room, his muscles aching from inactivity and strain. Then he would let himself drop upon his bed and sleep in another darkness that was more familiar and more safe. Occasionally he would interrupt his wait by the window and go down into the street. There the few buildings in Butcher's Crossing broke up his view of the land, so that it no longer stretched without limit in all directions, though at odd moments he had a feeling as if he were at a great distance above the town, and even above himself, gazing down upon a miniature cluster of buildings about which crawled a number of tiny figures, and from this small centre the land stretched outward endlessly, blotched and made shapeless by the point from which it spread. But more usually he wandered upon the street, among the people who seemed to flow into and out of Butcher's Crossing, as if by the impulse of an erratic but rhythmical tide. He went up and down the street, in and out of stores, paused, and went swiftly again, adjusting his motions to those of the people he moved among. Though he sought nothing in his mingling, he had odd and curious impressions that seemed to him important, perhaps because he did not seek them. He was not aware of these impressions as they occurred to him, but in the evening, as he lay in darkness on his bed, they came back to him with the force of freshness. He had an image of men moving silently in the streets amidst a clatter of sound that was extraneous to them, that defined rather than dispersed their silence. A few of them wore guns thrust carelessly in their waistbands, though most of them went unarmed. In his image, their faces had a marked similarity. They were brown and ridged, and the eyes, lighter than the skin, had a way of looking slightly upward and beyond whatever they appeared to gaze at. And finally he had the impression that they moved naturally and without strain, in a pattern so various and complex that his mind could not grasp it, a pattern whose secret passages could not be forced or opened by the will. During Miller's absence, he spoke of his own volition to only 3 persons, Francine, Charlie Hodge, and MacDonald. Once he saw Francine on the street. It was about noon, when few people were about. She was walking from Jackson's saloon toward the dry goods store, and they met at the entrance, which was directly across the street from the hotel. They exchanged greetings, and Francine asked him if he had got used to the country yet. As he replied, he noticed minute beads of sweat that stood out distinctly above her full upper lip and caught the sunlight like tiny crystals. They spoke for some moments, and an awkward silence fell between them. Francine stood solid and unmoving before him, smiling at him, her wide, pale eyes blinking slowly. At last he muttered an apology and walked away from her, up the street, as if he had some place to go. He saw her again early one morning as she descended the long stairway that came from the upper floor of Jackson's saloon. She wore a plain grey dress with the collar unbuttoned at the throat, and she came down the stairs with great care. The stairs were steep and open, so that she watched her feet as she placed them precisely at the center of the thick boards. Andrews stood on the board's sidewalk and watched her come down. She did not wear a hat, and as she came out of the shadow of the building, the morning brightness caught her loose reddish-gold hair and gave warmth to her pale face. Though she had not seen him as she came down, she looked up at him without surprise when she got to the sidewalk. "Good morning," Andrews said. She nodded and smiled. She remained facing him with one hand still on the rough wooden banister of the stair. She did not speak. "You were up early this morning," he said. "There's hardly anyone on the street." "When I get up early, I take a walk sometimes." "All alone?" She nodded. "Yes, it's good to walk alone in the morning. It's cool then. Soon it'll be winter and too cold to walk, and the hunters will be in town, and I won't be alone at all. So in the summer and fall I walk when I can in the morning." "This is a beautiful morning," Andrews said. "Yes," Francine said. "It's very cool." "Well," Andrews said doubtfully, and started to move away. "I suppose I'll leave you to your walk." Francine smiled and put her hand on his arm. "No, it's all right. You walk with me for a while. We'll talk." She took his arm, and they walked slowly up and down the street, speaking quietly, their voices distinct in the morning stillness. Andrews moved stiffly. He did not look often at the girl beside him, and he was conscious of every muscle that moved him with her. Though afterward he thought often about their walk, he could not remember anything they said. He saw Charlie Hodge more frequently. Usually their conversations were brief and perfunctory, but once, casually, in a remote connection, he mentioned that his father was a lay minister in the Unitarian Church. Charlie Hodge's eyes widened, his mouth dropped incredulously, and his voice took on a new note of respect. He explained to Andrews that he had been saved by a traveling preacher in Kansas City and had been given a Bible by that same man. He showed Andrews the Bible. It was a cheap edition, worn, with several pages torn. A deep brownish stain covered the corners of a number of the pages. Charlie explained that this was blood, buffalo blood, that he had got on the Bible just a few years ago. He wondered if he had committed, even by accident, a sacrilege. Andrews assured him that he had not. Thereafter, Charlie Hodge was eager to talk. Sometimes he even went to the effort of seeking Andrews out to discuss with him some point of fact or question of interpretation about the Bible. Soon, almost to his surprise, it occurred to Andrews that he did not know the Bible well enough to talk about it even on Charlie Hodge's terms, had not in fact ever read it with any degree of thoroughness. His father had encouraged his reading of Mr. Emerson, but had not, to his recollection, insisted that he read the Bible. Somewhat reluctantly, he explained this to Charlie Hodge. Charlie Hodge's eyes became lidded with suspicion, and when he spoke to Andrews again, it was in the tone of evangelicism rather than equality. As he listened to Charlie Hodge's exhortations, his mind wandered away from the impassioned words. He thought of the times, short months before, when he had been compelled to be present each morning at 8 at King's Chapel in Harvard College to listen to words much like the words to which he listened now. It amused him to compare the crude barroom that smelled of kerosene, liquor, and sweat to the austere, dark length of King's Chapel, where hundreds of soberly dressed young men gathered each morning to hear the mumbled word of God. Listening to Charlie Hodge, thinking of King's Chapel, he realized quite suddenly that it was some irony such as this that had driven him from Harvard College, from Boston, and thrust him into this strange world where he felt unaccountably at home. Sometimes, after listening to the droning voices in the chapel and in the classrooms, he had fled the confines of Cambridge to the fields and woods that lay southwestward to it. There, in some small solitude, standing on bare ground, he felt his head bathed by the clean air and uplifted into infinite space. The meanness and the constriction he had felt were dissipated in the wildness about him. A phrase from a lecture by Mr. Emerson that he had attended came to him. I became a transparent eyeball. Gathered in by field and wood, he was nothing. He saw all. The current of some nameless force circulated through him, and in a way that he could not feel in King's Chapel, in the college rooms, or on the Cambridge streets. He was a part and parcel of God, free and uncontained. Through the trees and across the rolling landscape, he had been able to see a hint of the distant horizon to the west, and there, for an instant, he had beheld somewhat as beautiful as his own undiscovered nature. Now, on the flat prairie around Butcher's Crossing, he regularly wandered, as if seeking a chapel more to his liking than King's or Jackson's Saloon. On one such sojourn, on the 5th day after Miller had left Butcher's Crossing, and on the day before he returned, Andrews went for the second time down the narrow rutted road toward the river, and on an impulse turned off the road onto the path that led to MacDonald's shack. Andrews walked through the doorway without knocking. MacDonald was seated behind his littered desk. He did not move as Andrews came into the room. Well, MacDonald said, and cleared his throat angrily. I see you've come back. Yes, sir, Andrews said. I promised I would tell you. MacDonald waved his hand impatiently. Don't tell me, he said. I already know. Pull up a chair. Andrews got a chair from the corner of the room and brought it up beside the desk. You know? MacDonald laughed shortly. Hell, yes, I know. Everybody in town knows. You gave Miller $600, and you're off on a big hunt. Up in Colorado, they say. You even know where we're going, Andrews said. MacDonald laughed again. You don't think you're the first one that Miller has tried to get in on this deal, do you? He's been trying for 4 years, maybe more, ever since I've known him anyway. By this time, I thought he'd have stopped. Andrews was silent for a moment. Finally, he said, It doesn't make any difference. You'll lose your tail, boy. Miller saw them buffalo, if he saw them at all, 10, 11 years ago. There's been a lot of hunting since then, and the herds have scattered. They don't all go where they used to go. You might find a few old strays, but that's all. You won't get your money back." Andrews shrugged. "It's a chance. Maybe I won't." "You could still back out," MacDonald said. "Look." He leaned across the table and pointed a stiff index finger at Andrews. "You back out. Miller will be mad, but he won't make trouble. You can get $400 or $500 back on the stuff you've laid out for. Hell, I'll buy it from you. And if you really want to go out on the hunt, I'll fix you up. I'll send you out on one of my parties from here. You won't be gone more than 3 or 4 days, and you'll make more off those 3 or 4 days than you will off the whole trip with Miller." Andrews shook his head. "I've given my word. But it's kind of you, Mr. MacDonald. I thank you very much." "Well," MacDonald said after a moment, "I didn't think you'd back out. Too stubborn. Knew it when I first saw you. But it's your money, none of my business." They were silent for a long while. Andrew said at last, "Well, I wanted to see you before I left. Miller will be coming back tomorrow or the next day, and I won't know when we'll take off from here." He got up from the chair and put it back in its corner. "One thing," MacDonald said, not looking at him. "That's rough country you're going up into. You do what Miller tells you. He may be a son of a bitch, but he knows the country. You listen to him, and don't go thinking you know anything at all." Andrews nodded. "Yes, sir." He went forward until his thighs pressed against MacDonald's desk, and he was bent a little above MacDonald's disheveled face. "I hope you do not think I am ungrateful in this matter. I know that you are a kind man and that you have my best interests in mind. I am truly indebted to you." MacDonald's mouth had slowly opened, and now it hung incredulously wide, and his round eyes were watching Andrews. Andrews turned from him and walked out of the little shack into the sunlight. In the sunlight, he paused. He wondered if he wished to go back to the town just now. Unable to decide, he let his feet carry him vaguely along the wagon tracks to the main road. There he hesitated for a moment, to turn first one way and another, as the needle of a compass, slow to settle, discovers its point. He believed, and had believed for a long time, that there was a subtle magnetism in nature, which, if he unconsciously yielded to it, would direct him aright, not indifferent to the way he walked. But he felt that only during the few days that he had been in Butcher's Crossing had nature been so purely presented to him that its power of compulsion was sufficiently strong to strike through his will, his habit, and his idea. He turned west, his back towards Butcher's Crossing and the towns and cities that lay eastward beyond it. He walked past the clump of cottonwoods toward the river he had not seen, but which had assumed in his mind the proportions of a vast boundary that lay between himself and the wildness and freedom that his instinct sought. The mounded banks of the river rose abruptly up, though the road ascended less steeply in a gradual cut. Andrews left the road and went into the prairie grass, which whipped about his ankles and worked beneath his trouser legs and clung to his skin. He paused atop the mound and looked down at the river. It was a thin, muddy trickle over flat rocks where the road crossed it, but above and below the road deeper pools lay flat and greenish-brown in the sun. He turned his body a little to the left so that he could no longer see the road that led back to Butcher's Crossing. Looking out at the flat, featureless land into which he seemed to flow and merge, even though he stood without moving, he realized that the hunt that he had arranged with Miller was only a stratagem, a ruse upon himself, a palliative for ingrained custom and use. No business led him where he looked, or where he would go. He went there free. He went free upon the plain in the western horizon, which seemed to stretch without interruption toward the setting sun, and he could not believe that there were towns and cities in it of enough consequence to disturb him. He felt that wherever he lived, and wherever he would live hereafter, he was leaving the city more and more, withdrawing into the wilderness. He felt that that was the central meaning he could find in all his life, and it seemed to him then that all the events of his childhood and his youth had led him unknowingly to this moment upon which he poised, as if before flight. He looked at the river again. On this side is the city, he thought, and on that the wilderness. And though I must return, even that return is only another means I have of leaving it, more and more. He turned. Butcher's Crossing lay small and unreal before him. He walked slowly back toward the town, on the road, his feet scuffing in the dust, his eyes watching the puffs of dust that his feet went beyond.